It's my pleasure now to welcome to his first annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium the new Dean of the Law School, who joins us from Case Western Reserve University Law School, where he served as provost, oversaw a number of international law programs and centers, and brings a new and very real verve and energy to the College of Law, and I encourage you to meet him when the opportunity presents itself during the course of the day. We're all very proud to have with us Hiram Chodosh.
Thanks, Bob. What Bob didn't tell you by way of announcement is that on Tuesday it's going to be 60 degrees. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and to welcome you to the Stegner Center's 12th Symposium. The College of Law is dedicated to deepening our understanding of the critical issues of our time, training the next generation of leaders to work on problems of law and policy, and providing direct public service to the local, national, and global communities. As you know, the Stegner Center is one of the premier institutions in the country dedicated to advancing understanding and policy insights on the challenges of preserving, distributing, harnessing, and restoring our world's critical natural resources: land, air, water. Just last week, the Center co-sponsored the Fordham debate on alternative solutions to climate change, and this week, the Center takes on yet another large question: how to share limited supplies of water in a time and region of tremendous growth and stress. None of these invaluable contributions and insights could be possible without four special investments: strong financial support from our donors, strong program and administrative support from our staff, strong leadership from College of Law faculty, and perhaps most critically, strong interest from all of you, the audience. First, we've benefited from the financial support for this conference and over the years from so many of you. In particular, the Burton Foundation, the Quinney Foundation, so critical to the success of the Stegner Center and to the law school in the past and its bright future, the Cultural Visions Fund, the Nature Conservancy of Utah, and today I want to make special mention of the Chevron, including Dan Johnson, who's here with us this morning. And sir, I have a special poster for you. Thank you very much. Second, Jan Nystrom, Associate Director of the Stegner Center, and the rest of the law school staff and students have done just such a tremendous job in putting this entire program together. Money and ideas are important, to be sure, but Jan and so many others make it all happen. So let's pause and give them a hand of applause as well. Third, as you well know, we have some of the world's leading intellectual leaders in the environmental field, not only throughout the university, but here at the law school, from Amy Wildermuth and Nancy McLaughlin and Bill Lockhart to Bob Adler and Bob Kiter. In particular today, I'd like to thank Bob Adler, the James I. Farr Professor of Law and our Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, who has been the intellectual force behind this year's symposium, and Bob Kiter, the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law and Director of the Center, whose intellectual and administrative leadership over the years have been the key to the success of this collaborative program. Let's give them a round of applause as well. Finally, none of this would be possible without each and every one of you, the participants in the next 2 days of discussion. Since coming here, I have been so impressed by the deep commitment of this community to not only the issues, but to these programs. And I can't thank you enough for your continued engagement and support. Arguably, ideas alone don't change the world. Jean Monnet, founder of the European Union, was once known to have said, "Every new idea is a bad idea until it has an institution." And to paraphrase from Wallace Stegner himself, it is your will that will save our resources, your will that will create new institutions, and your will that will create new solutions. Have a wonderful conference, and thank you each for coming. And now back to Bob Kiter. Bob, thank you.
Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Hiram, for kicking off the 12th Annual Stegner Center Conference. I would like to join Hiram both in thanking our funders and supporters over the years. I won't rename them. I also would like to thank my faculty colleagues, in particular Bob Adler, Bill Lockhart, Amy Wildermuth, and Nancy McLaughlin, as well as Jan Nystrom and Jenny Wehrstall for all of the support that they have provided, both with respect to this conference and with Stegner Center activities. The past year has been a busy one for the Stegner Center. I won't go into any detail with respect to what has been going on, other than to note that we provide a chronicle of the past year in the life of the Stegner Center in the annual newsletter that is included in the packet of materials that you received. Noteworthy are the initiation and the second young scholar that we have had here at the College of Law as a young Stegner Center scholar with the support of the Cultural Vision Fund, and we're very thankful for that. I also should note that we're very thankful for the support that we have received to initially establish, maintain the O'Hara Fellowship, which is covered in substantial detail within the newsletter. There are several upcoming events. You've also got word and news about that within the packet. Let me highlight the series of green bags that still remain during the course of this semester, as well as the evening with world-acclaimed author Jim Harrison on March 8th right here at the College of Law that the Stegner Center will be hosting in conjunction with the King's English Bookstore to celebrate the publication of Jim's newest novel. I should add an event that is not noted on your materials that we will be hosting later this spring, in all likelihood, is a reading with the author and daughter-in-law of Wallace Stegner, Lynn Stegner, whose new book was just published, and she will be here in Salt Lake under the sponsorship of the Stegner Center, and we'll get word out about that event later. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speakers, who, as you know, will be addressing the future of the Colorado River Compact. Perhaps Wallace Stegner summed it up correctly in his own writing. That is, in terms of the topic today, whether or not the compact is or should be enduring the underlying theme of the conference. When he wrote, I quote, in 1968, we have not only looked with suspicion on the dead hand of the past, we have been unwilling to admit that we cannot make the most profound social changes by a simple act of will or law. We'll see how Stegner's words resonate as we move through the symposium. Let me introduce now our lead-off speaker, someone who I suspect is well known to just about everyone in the audience, if not personally, then through her writing and speaking, which has been extraordinarily prolific over the years, and that is Professor Patty Limerick, who serves as faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Patty, we're pleased to have you with us and to kick things off for us today.
Well, thank you very much for this occasion. It is unquestionably daunting, and I will begin with a reminiscence of my a story that comes to my mind at occasions like this. This room is filled with expertise, ladies and gentlemen, and the overflow room is probably filled too. And I am here with considerable humility standing in front of you now. When I was graduating from high school, I had a roommate who was hoping to be a stage manager, and she wrote to different stage managers around the country and asked if she could get a job with them and work with them. She got a number of letters back. She got one that just intrigued us. It was handwritten, and it seemed so honest. This fellow wrote about the difficulty of becoming a stage manager, and then at the very end of the letter, and it's interesting handwriting, he wrote, "I am a fraud. I cannot help you." We thought, well, what an interesting man, and so honest. And the more you know about a field, in some ways, the less you know. And we really admired him. We talked about how much we'd like to go to Pittsburgh and see his theater sometime. And then one day, so the letter was sitting on our coffee table. Somebody picked that up and looked at it, and they said, "Wait, it actually says, I am afraid I cannot help you." It's really... So that was a lesson to us, and I think of that on these occasions. I am a fraud. I can't help. Well, I'm doing my best, but I'm very respectful of the expertise in this room. I thought for a moment, well, perhaps I was asked this honored position of starting us off because, in a little-known professional achievement, I'm quite an expert on Warren Harding. And the compact occurred during Warren Harding's presidency, and is usually people don't think of anything coming out of Warren Harding's presidency except Teapot Dome. They think about that, and they think about a sad habit of being a heavy drinker during Prohibition, which didn't set an example to youth in America. But I am quite an expert, and I'm also the author of the best limerick about Warren Harding ever composed. It has an absolutely beautiful internal rhyme. His slogan, as you know, was a return to normalcy, and he did have these habits of hanging out with cronies that were not too positive. So here's the limerick, and that I think you'll be dazzled by the beauty of the internal rhyme there, and if you're not, I don't want to hear about it. But anyway, here it goes. There was an old man named Warren who hated all things foreign. He liked to live normally, drunk and informally, and spend his time gambling and whoring. So that's one of the most exciting things about the story of the compact, is that the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, usually known for his bad behavior with Teapot Dome and the complexity of that, he actually did a pretty good job in this. Albert Fall actually was a pretty good fellow out there talking about the importance of federal authority over the Colorado River, so it's a different kind of Albert Fall than the one who has persisted most centrally in our minds. But in any case, I thought maybe Warren Harding, but in fact, Warren Harding does not really seem to have been a very active player in the compact, and that may be why there was a compact, because had he been more active, who knows. I thought, well, it's interesting to look up. I thought I would learn something ironic and interesting about Hindsight if I looked at the Bishop's Lodge website to see how the side of the compact negotiation was faring out. One of the things that they advertise as being particularly available at the Bishop's Lodge of the present is fairy tale weddings. Very wonderful place to get married. I thought they should probably warn the couples who are married there that this could be a pretty stormy marriage if it is launched at the Bishop's Lodge, that they should probably keep their lawyers' phone numbers at hand during the marriage. And I thought maybe the main thing about Bishop's Lodge now is that it is such a symbol outside Santa Fe, classic resort community, such a symbol of the New West economy of tourism and recreation and amenities that the compact negotiators did not see coming. So, in that spirit of looking, the first few minutes here, I don't think it'll be more than 5 or 6 minutes, will be insufferably smug, and you deserve a warning on that. I'm going to go through the 10 biggest points, what I consider to be the 10 biggest points of hindsight, that in 2007, as we look back at the compact negotiators, we think, well, they didn't get that, did they? So it will be insufferably smug, but when we're through this, I guess you should take a big breath of oxygen to get your way through as smugness fills the room here. But the point of it is to come to the end of that list and to consider how hindsight actually is a wonderful invitation to humility in us, because first of all, we do not know what the people 70 or 80 years later from us will be finding to be absurdly missing in our thinking and consciousness. And also, there's a number of things that befuddled the commissioners at the compact that in fact still befuddle us. So here we go for a quick top 10 review of the hindsight points. What the commissioners either did not see coming or were indifferent to, because it was matters that fell completely outside anything they would have considered significant. So here's my top 10, and I'll be very interested during the breaks and over the next couple of days to see if other people have nominations of things they think should have been in this list. First, very big one. The wrong numbers on the flow, wrong estimate of the flow. I've thought about maybe holding that off. I thought, no, you got to start there. That's where it begins. Declaring the annual stream flow based on some wet years, missing the river's core characteristic of great variability. Oops, that was a very large one. Then another second one that I thought probably had to come right up at the top here, believing that they were creating an agreement that would minimize, maybe even eliminate litigation. Oops. Well, unintended consequences. Arizona versus California, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The dream of heading away from litigation, forestalling litigation, and in fact providing a great framework for litigation. Third, a failure to see the mounting lack of force behind putting irrigated agriculture as the Western priority. So their faith that irrigated agriculture would remain, in some ways, the most important activity in the West, the assumption that that was permanent, and then in hindsight now we see how much that was the product of the famous Jeffersonian agrarian dream, a faith system, really more of a faith system than a calculated rational economic choice, and that one very much went out from under the commissioners over the last decade. So the belief that irrigated agriculture was a mandate, a necessity for American activity in the arid West, how precarious and fragile that became over time. Fourth, the rise of recreation as an industry, as an economic force, as an enterprise with considerable political clout, who in 1922 could have seen that coming. One of the things I've so enjoyed doing with different audiences is imagining how we would play and win the game called Astonish the Immigrant. If we could bring somebody back from the 19th century and bring them into the 21st century, what would we put forward as the thing that would most amaze a 19th century pioneer if we could resurrect such a person and bring back? Well, you could waste your time with airplanes. I don't really think, they had little fantasies about dirigibles and balloons going places. You could do the internet, not a world apart from telegraphs, I don't think so. My nomination has always been take them to a courtroom in which a case involving predator control is being tried, and take the pioneer, first thing a pioneer or settler wanted to do, get rid of the predators, save the livestock, protect the livestock, bring them into the courtroom, point to the attorneys on one side and say, in our time, predators have attorneys. Or, as my friend, the colonial historian Helena Wall modified that, predators have always had attorneys. What's new in our time is that animal predators have attorneys. So, of all the things in 1922, if you wanted to astonish one of those, if we got to play this game and we could bring one of the compact commissioners back for a visit to the present, I vote for an REI store as the place to go and to say, this is big business, gentlemen. This is really big business. Who would ever have seen that coming? So, fifth, a little package of items which we'll just kind of label natural processes that they may have been aware of but simply did not put enough emphasis or give enough respect to, and that's a little trio. First, so point 5 here has 3 little items because I wanted to come out even at 10, so that's how that happened. But evaporation, and I sure went around for a long time thinking that the main issue in the West was sparse rainfall, like precipitation, but of course that ET, not the little creature with the M&Ms, but ET, evapotranspiration, that is a huge part of the story. All that sunshine that we glory in, the escape from eastern clouds and humidity, the price of that, of course, is an enormously powerful force of evaporation and transpiration, and just an extraordinary factor when it comes to reservoirs and the water that you put into them and what becomes of it. A second item under 5, silt. It's not an easy thing to tell a human being, proud human being maybe with an engineering degree, law degree, record of public office, a commissioner, to say, you'd better respect silt. That is a big force, and it might outfox you. Silt might end up being smarter than you. That's a very offensive thing to say to a human being with a, right, Jack, you said it to many human beings, and you know how they react to that. Nature's big challenge to dams, what happens with silt and the rapidity with which some dams can turn into filled collections of silt. So 5B, then silt, and then 5C, floods, lower river floods, and the wonderful, wonderful fantasy. It must have been a great joy to be able to be a believer in that fantasy of flood control, that you will take basically what this river does. If you said, what does the Colorado River do before the dams? It floods. That is its thing. It does that, and it does that at a scale that's very impressive and astonishing. And so to put yourself in opposition of that and to insufficiently respect the power of floods, well, okay, so those three natural processes of evaporation, silt, flood control, hindsight moment, they didn't get that. Number 6, the resurgence of Indian people. They did not see that coming, although maybe they did. I mean, that's an interesting phrase, that the compact does not have bearing, does not restrict, does not address Indian issues. That's maybe an appropriately modest recognition that this might turn into a thing and that they would at least get out of its path. But certainly the failure to reckon with Indian issues, and especially since the Winters decision had pre-existed the compact, there must have been in their minds some recognition of that, but to treat it so briefly and so just on the borders of dismissively, that certainly gives us a hindsight moment of smugness. And then 7th, the same thing with Mexico, that Mexico could be mentioned, discussed, maybe even worried over, but the fact that North America is a unit and that Mexico's well-being and the United States' well-being are part of the same package, that certainly was something that was not anywhere near as much on their consciousness as it is on ours. 8th, population growth and the proliferation of demand, the astonishing growth rates in the West and in the arid West and in the compact states in the last 30 or 40 years, the rise, sometimes fall and return of various new demands. Oil shale in the western slope of Colorado could be adding a factor of water use here that really goes beyond, well, anything that we might even be imagining, much less what the compact commissioners might have thought about. Front range diversions for many communities on the Front Range, maybe especially communities like Douglas County. There is a considerable hope that that party is not over, that party might go on. So that proliferation of demand through population growth didn't really get a grip on how much that was going to go off. 9th, and maybe the biggest of them all, the transformation of American attitudes towards nature under a very short timetable, astonishingly rapid switcheroo. Because if you go to the 19th century, most Americans are looking at arid places saying, this is a wasteland, who would ever want this? We might as well turn it into farmland or ignore it because it's worth nothing. And that astonishing rapidity of an appreciation of deserts, a fondness for deserts. I mean, John Muir, that whole movement, that was about green places, the creation of national parks. It had to have some significant unit of green. It still surprises me that in the arid West we talk about a green movement or a green action. It should be called an olive green movement in the American West, or maybe even a brown movement for the West. But that basic hardwired sense in American thinking that green meant pretty in nature, and the rapidity with which that changed, plus the expansion of value in nature, including creatures that do not have, it's just, what are those names? Humpback chub. Oh, for heaven's sake, what a burden to carry in life. Can you imagine trying to run for president with a name that was as clumsy as that, or anything like humpback chub? Oh dear. Well, at least we got rid of squawfish. That was good. But pike minnow still doesn't sing. And it's so without charisma. I mean, whatever a charismatic megafauna is, it's probably not a humpback chub. I'm really off in a Gary Larson moment here, just imagining how you could get a better image for the humpback chub. But not only this transformation of attitudes and new valuation of creatures that had not been much valued or noticed, but then the embodiment of those values in federal law, in major consequential 1970s federal law. It's that we take them so much for granted that it is remarkable to think how we need to go back and think how recent those laws are and how much our circumstances have been changed by Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, and so on. And then, 10th, a very abstract one, which I'm entitled to because I'm an academic, definitions of progress in some very basic ways reverse directions. And if there's anything more disorienting, it's that. As a society, to be marching towards a goal of development as a valuable thing, the phrase used in the 19th century that the West was troubled with manless lands, longing for landless men, that whole vision that more stuff going on, more economic activity, more busy enterprise of extraction, that was the value, and to have, and again, such a short period of time, a significant reversal of that definition of progress, where, in fact, regret comes to characterize the evaluation of that development, and a different sense of progress comes into play by which seizing that sort of development, or even reversing its effects, is the new definition of progress. There is hindsight, where humility has to come into play. Hindsight is not, in fact, 2020. Hindsight at this moment, as we contemplate this amazing package of changes, a recognition of how unlikely it is that we would have been any cleverer ourselves had we been those commissioners, that we would have been any better at seeing the future. Those are enormous changes. No wonder they didn't see them coming. And there is much more to think about than just the smugness of we have this recognized and they didn't. So let me just take a few of these matters and try to undo the smugness. Take the getting the numbers wrong on the annual flow. Justice House, I'm so interested in knowing if you agree with me on this, but if they hadn't gotten those numbers wrong, would there have been a compact? Wasn't that, in fact, the secret of success of the compact, of thinking there was enough water to make this deal? And had they had a realistic estimate of the flow, would they have been able to reach an agreement that maybe, in fact, that error was the secret of their success, which can make your head ache if you start thinking too much about that notion that the more we flub in our calculations, the better our decisions will be, or the more likely we'll be able to reach agreement. In some ways, I think you could say that the West's problem today, the one we're still wrestling with, is that there was too much water in the Colorado. In fact, even in the short years, contrast the interior of Australia. That's a place where you can say they have too little water. In fact, we had, you might say, too much water because we have had so much to fight about. It's the fact that there is Colorado is what, sixth in the nation? That's a pretty big river. That's a river of consequence. A trickle, if it were the Humboldt River, well, I don't know how we're going to reorient the Humboldt and send it south, but if the flow of the Humboldt had been what we were dealing with, the growth issues would not have been a problem. Right? There's a clearer, much clearer limit. So it is actually the abundance of water. In a curious way, the numbers, the miscalculation, evaluating that gets us into much more of a complicated interpretation than it brings us to clarity. What did it mean for them to, in fact, be misled by those numbers, and did that, in fact, make their success at consensus possible? A second place I think where hindsight needs to be roughed up, thought about, is it really so bad that litigation proliferated from the compact? As a Western historian, no one is ever going to make me sad about this being a litigious society, because I prefer courtrooms to battlefields. I prefer them to shootouts. I like lawyers. I like lawyers a lot. If you go back to the 19th century and you see many of the same issues about which we are suing each other in the 19th century, you see people shooting each other, mutilating each other for those wars. Hurrah for the courtroom to give litigation a framework. That's a public service. That's not necessarily a defeat or a matter for smugness. A third item, agriculture. We're still in a muddle on that one. We have no place to take a high ground, hindsight, smug perspective on the commissioners. We still are not at all clear what we want on this. Do we want to be hard-headed? Farmers aren't making it financially. Big mistake, big policy mistake to try to make the arid West into a farming zone that would compete with the Midwest or compete with Chile and other international sites? Or do we want to, what I really myself prefer, to have appropriate cultural loyalty to what farming and ranching means, and how important that is to us as a people, and how valuable it is for us to have some connection with food and fiber and its production. It seems to me we are as muddled as, well, the difference between the commissioners, I guess, was that they thought they had it figured out, but in terms of our situation today, I don't see how we could make any claim of smugness of saying that we had come to a better understanding of that issue than they had. So, okay, so now what I want to do is make one big point that I think adds up most of these factors of hindsight, and then I want to move on to foresight and an imperial stance that I shall take. I have a tiara for that. What I think a lot of these things add up to is a big statement of failure for a concept that the commissioners never would have imagined, and they certainly bear no responsibility for this. This one is ours. The idea that nature comes with a carrying capacity and that water carries the message of that carrying capacity. What a nice idea that was. What a wonderful way of removing decision-making burdens from human society by saying the limited water of the West sets the constraints on our growth and settlement. What a great idea. You can see it in the 1850s. You can see Stephen Douglas saying, we will not have to fight over slavery because slavery will not work in the arid West. Water will solve our problem for us. We won't have to have a national war over this because nature has decreed that slavery won't work in the West. Well, that didn't turn out to work, did it? The Civil War was hardly prohibited by aridity, but that desire to say nature will make our most difficult, our most agonizing decisions for us, it did not come off. And one reason, the biggest reason it didn't come off, is that human ingenuity is such an astonishing force. And here, this may be my first public statement of what is just a private, romantic reality for me. I have gone mad for engineers. I love engineers. I swoon in the company. I don't swoon. They would revive me. They would revive me. If I swooned, the engineers would be the first there to get me back on my feet. They are an astonishing force. Now, they are a force that has produced some mischief in our lives because they have been disconnected from society. We have said to engineers, get us everything we want in the way of material reality when we want it, but do not disturb us with the sites of production. Do not disturb our viewshed with that. So we have said, get us what we want, but keep production out of sight and out of mind. If we unkink that relationship, the powers of the human mind as represented in engineers, I think they're astonishing. For the Bureau of Reclamation Centennial, I learned things I had never imagined about how difficult it was to design concrete that would work in Western waters. Certain chemicals in Western waters attack concrete. That also was a Gary Larson cartoon waiting to happen there. But what the engineers of the Bureau of Reclamation had to do to redesign concrete, amazing, enterprising, courageous, plucky, take that force, the ingenuity that defeated the carrying capacity idea of Western water, that would set a limit to our growth, hook that ingenuity up to other causes. Connect the ties between society and engineers, refuse that out of sight, out of mind thing, and direct them especially to causes like restoration. And I think if we could just, I don't know, not sure where we're going to get the money for this, but we get Bob Adler's new book on restoration and we buy a copy for every civil engineer in the country, it's a better world. I'll contribute. I'll write the first check for that. And they will read it with eagerness because many of the engineers, I think, are very aware of the fact that they have capacity that is not getting directed to the causes that will make the biggest difference in our lives. So, okay, so I feel that the defeat of the carrying capacity idea carries its own great hope and promise, because what defeated the limitations of nature, apparently built into the water supply, was human ingenuity. That ingenuity is available to us. It is available to us to use for greater efficiency and conservation, to use in restoration. We just need to take engineers to lunch and go dancing with them and involve them in our lives in very engaged ways. May need to pray with them. I don't know. Maybe that would work or not. Okay, so Bennett Rayleigh, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for a number of years with jurisdiction over water issues, I guess he was in a little bit of wasn't really a direct debate with your own Dan McCool, and he made a somewhat dismissive remark about professors who feel that they can just become the king or queen and decide what to do about the Colorado River Compact. So, here we are. Not a comfortable crown. If you've seen the movie The Queen, you can see why it was very burdensome to be queen, because this is about to spring off my head, I think, in an upward mode. Okay, so what I'm going to do now for just the last couple of minutes here, I'm going to decree certain things in a queenly manner. Helen Mirren was very good and won Best Actress, and I'm going to do my best to sort of go in that mode for the next couple of minutes here. The first few things, I only have one absolute decree and mandate as queen, but I have 4 or 5 things that I would like to be, I'm the queen, I would require be part of the discussion. The great experiment underway in the last 150 years, this is not the Queen's remark, excuse me, I have to, pardon me, now I've got my hair clipping. Oh, the Queen. How does she handle her hair clip? I wonder on that. Okay, before I get to the Queen in just a second here, or become the Queen, the great experiment of the last 150 years is testing whether democracy and conservation work together. The origins of resource conservation lie in aristocracy, monarchy, colonialism, and imperialism. The inspirational examples of the more distant past come from the king saying, we are going to keep the game prosperous on this estate. The king had a great advantage in implementing his management plans because he could cut the heads off poachers, for instance. So as Europeans moved out into the rest of the planet, they saw things in nature they valued, they restrained the locals from using them. So a lot of the practices of conservation that were most powerful and most effective come from the unilateral exercise of power. Now, that's not good. Aristocracy, monarchy, colonialism, imperialism, that's nothing to get nostalgic about. But it is a way of telling us what an experiment we've been involved in the United States to see if democratic process and restraint on resource use, preservation, conservation, longer-term use, if that is compatible with democracy. And it's a wonderful experiment, and much of the world's future rests on it. But every now and then, it's nice to go unilateral. So here are the monarchical decrees of what we will do as we consider the Colorado River Compact and our stance to it in our time. First, it's very difficult not to speak as the Queen here on this one, but future understandings, actions towards reforms of the compact will, there's no could or should or might, will deal with the proliferation of uses since 1922, including the shift of economic sectors and what part of states' economies come from what economic activities, but also the rise of environmental regulation and a whole new set of values introduced. Future configurations of the compact will deal with that proliferation of uses and values. Second, future configurations will deal with the fact that the estimates of the flow, the estimates were wrong, and that is lucky in unexpected ways because that challenges our ingenuity. It asks us to come up with creative ways. If I can get the exchequer of the Treasury to do it, we would have a giant prize for a competition for the best, most creative, most original plan for what to do now that we know that those flows were overestimated. Third, basins and the point of division between an upper and a lower basin, that was conjured into being. It is a human construction, a human idea, and it can be conjured again in a more appropriate way. So future configurations will not take the existing definition of basin and division point between those basins for granted because, in fact, of all the things, the Queen does not really deal in cultural theory, but she'll do it for a moment here. Cultural and social construction, those basins exist more in the human mind and in the text of many decisions than they exist in physical reality. So basins, having been conjured into being, can be reconjured to fit these other points of reckoning. Fourth, we will not engage in blame of those in the past or of those among us. If anything, we will engage in envy of those in the past who had a comparatively uncluttered conceptual world to live in. But we will recognize, well, in fact, if you just take a moment, when those commissioners met in private session at Bishop's Lodge, they could each take 2 advisors in with them. And it was so, what a world to live in, where you could bring a legal advisor and an engineering advisor. Each of them had those, and that would be a sufficient team of advice. Now a commissioner would have to rent a stadium for all the advisors each commissioner would have to bring. So no wasting of our time and blame. Most unproductive use of human energy. Do not have enough energy to devote to that cause, so no blame. Fifth, we shall dump most models, actually we will dump all models of conflict over the Colorado in which there are only 2 sides. And we will dump them because those are inaccurate. Those are drastically inaccurate. It's the rarest of cases where you have your nature-loving side and your preservationist side, or your species-loving side and your recreational releases for boating side. It is remarkable spectrum of probably literally hundreds, if we listed them all, constituencies, and to divide them up into two sides is simply to distort what is actually a situation of hybridity, mixture, and confusion. We will have performed in all the basin states frequent adapted versions of Romeo and Juliet, where the Capulets and Montagues are replaced with different feuding factions who have these. The plot for the Romeo and Juliet plays will be okay. Well, I'll be out of here in a second, and we'll do questions. Okay, so this is very important. The Romeo and Juliet plays will have, for instance, a Bureau of Reclamation employee's son will be Romeo, and the daughter of a river rafter will be Juliet. And there are thousands and thousands of configurations to do this. And there we take some liberties with Shakespeare because it's very tragic for a while, and it looks like they will never be able to marry. And then an interagency memo of understanding is negotiated. And Romeo and Juliet marry, and they have little half-breed children who are half Bureau of Reclamation and half river rafter, and we are all put back together. The Queen does have jurisdiction over Shakespeare, I think, on that. And then 6, and this is the only thing that is absolutely non-negotiable and simply an imperative. Efficiency and conservation are not options anymore after the Queen's proclamations here. You practice efficiency and conservation in water use. You separate your desires from your needs, and you only ask for water for your needs. And if you do not meet this mandate, you are in very big trouble, and your rights become very, very junior and vanish off into the distant western horizon. So that's the Queen's thing. Now we get to the biggest interpretive point in my last remark, which is historical interpretation is never settled. Here are a couple, and there's plenty more, but a couple of ways we could look at the success of those folks in November of 1922. They could be to us people who built a structure that we are stuck with, the phrase used earlier by the Dean quoting Stegner, the dead hand of the past. We could look at this as some people who got together and created a structure that we are stuck with, that we have to live with. We could do that. Or we could go back, say, to October of 1922 and imagine how it looked there, and we could say, well, this is an example of people who seem to be getting nowhere in negotiation, but who turned it around and who reached an agreement, who has exerted their will, compromised, rethought their non-negotiable positions. We could have the meaning of the compact with very legitimate historical interpretation. One meaning could be that human beings operate within constraints that they cannot change, and the compact sits on our shoulders and we are bound by it, and that's the end of that. Or we could look at the story of the creation of the compact as human beings exerting an extraordinary power to innovate and break free of constraints. Both of those morals to the story, both of those lessons to the parable are available to us. I vote for the one where we see human resilience, human flexibility, human ingenuity. Many of you in the room know that I am a widow. My husband died of a stroke 2 years ago. For his memorial service, he was not a particularly church-going kind of person, but I was very taken with the phrase in Deuteronomy as it matched, I thought, the way Jeff had lived his life. And I put it at the top of his memorial service. At the top of the program, I have put before thee life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. So I thought that Jeff had done that. I thought Jeff had rejected fatalism, and on any occasion where he had such a choice between life and death, blessing and cursing, he chose life. So pardon my venture into theology here, but I feel certain that that phrase from Deuteronomy, therefore choose life, has practical and direct power to encourage us, to guide us into looking closely, respectfully, and critically at the Colorado River Compact, and to apply our extraordinary human gifts to choosing the right thing, to choosing life for the Colorado River and for each other and for posterity. Thank you. So I had just a few minutes for questions, but if there's questions or comments, or if the Queen's subjects are planning a rebellion already, I guess I should know that. Yeah.
Queen have any plans for Mexico?
Well, the Queen feels very strongly that the problems of Mexican immigration are not going to be addressed in anything but superficial ways until the economic well-being of Mexico gets reckoned with. So to the degree that this is a part of that whole story, the Queen feels very strongly that the dismissal of Mexico, that can't go on anymore, because to the degree that we are a nation shaken by, preoccupied with immigration, the root solution to that is to do our best on behalf of Mexico's economy and well-being. And here, I was so taken in Bob Adler's book. He has a passage which I don't think will make him popular in some circles, where he talks about the selfishness of some preservationists and nature lovers who take a stance of, this was my river and now it's not. Now it's just all filled with other people, and the really kind of self-indulgent mode of that. And that colors a lot of discussion of why nature must be restored or preserved. So all I'm saying is that I personally feel that the Delta, every description you read of someone visiting the Delta in the 19th century is hypnotic. It's an astonishing place of life and vitality. I'm drawn to that. I don't know, in a world of such scarce resources and such a struggle for it, I don't know how far we can go in saying that has to be a priority. But to the degree that we can make up, address, reckon with years of very arrogant, very rude behavior towards our neighbors, I think that's a part of it. But to say that Delta's restoration, I mean, that's been such a terrible, terrible long phase of water deprivation. But the good news is that people who know what they're talking about will be speaking on this subject soon, and I will be taking notes in that phase. The Queen really ought to study more before she stands up in front of a crowd. So. Yeah.
How would the Queen deal with American Indian traditional claims towards river resources and also their need for economic development?
Yeah, Indian people and their need for economic development, but also their traditional uses. I have not been comfortable with the occasions, like especially around nuclear waste disposal, where white people with their ideas of what is appropriate environmental behavior say to Indian people, well, you can't have a nuclear waste site, or you can't, as the Ute people have done with Animas La Plata, asked for paper water in order to really make a market thing on that, for something that, after all this century and a half of white folks saying to Indians, you have to learn to be business people like us, when they do it, to say, oh no, not to compete with us, we never meant that. So consistency requires that, but I don't know why, if this sense of reckoning, respecting, and speaking critically to each other, if we pull that off, Indian people have to be part of that too, in terms of what Indian people can say about us and our practices, but also what we can say about them, so that if we can say, this seems, the securing of paper water rights and aggressive marketing of them, does that really address your children's circumstances at finding jobs on this reservation and staying with their families? I think if, in a world that we are not very close to living in, it would be necessary to have those kinds of conversations. If, instead of us saying Indian people are supposed to be ecological saints, they are supposed to love nature, they are supposed to abhor dams, they're supposed to run from a check for water marketing, they would never want to have anything to do with that. Instead of imposing that noble, savage, tired old image, I think it's fair to just have it, to work towards having open discussions about, will this use of the water, will this get you the kind of community, the kind of life for your families that you really want? Yeah. Uh-huh.
Without us finding blame, how do we tell the Queen that she is wrong?
How do you tell? How, goodness.
Hold her accountability. Hold her accountability.
Well, that's what's been so interesting about watching monarchies over time here. They are not riding very high. I mean, if you did see the movie, even poor Diana, I beg pardon? Right. Right. But I guess, do you want to take on some particular thing that I just...
No. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that when we make statements, we also we have to show respect.
Yeah.
We also have to hold people accountable.
Right. Oh, good point. Yeah. Well, I think that's a wonderful question for us all to contemplate. Holding someone accountable, blaming somebody. They have a great border territory there and considerable overlap, but one is productive and one is the end of the game. The one is why don't we just go home now because nothing's going to come out of it. So what accountable means, you could do something. If you have flubbed, erred, sinned, whatever, you can do something. Blame just means you're screwed. Well, I'm not going to use some of the other words I was going to use there, but you're beyond redemption. I know I'm probably running out of time. I'm going to stop it. But I was writing a speech for a conference on nuclear waste issues, and I didn't think I had the right speech. I got up about 6 in the morning. I was in Seattle. I turned on my TV just to have some background noise while I was looking over my speech and trying to improve it. And the only thing on at 6 o'clock in the morning in Seattle was a religious talk show. And I listened for a few minutes. I didn't quite follow what they were talking. I wasn't paying close attention. And then they took a station break, and it was so great because I'm talking about nuclear waste in my speech. And the announcer said, use the name of the program. And he said, "Guilt and Redemption will continue in a minute." I thought, will it ever? Boy, oh boy. So there.